"You should have stayed home, Evelyn. This will be over in 10 minutes." Those were the first words my father said to me on the morning he laughed at me in court. I remember them clearly because everyone around him laughed too. The sound followed me as I walked into the county courthouse in Cedar Ridge, Ohio. It was a cold November morning. Gray clouds hung low over the town square, and a sharp wind rattled the bare branches outside the courthouse windows. I pulled my coat tighter and continued toward the courtroom without responding. At 68 years old, I had learned that some arguments were not worth having, especially with my father. Walter Harper was 87 and had spent most of his life convincing people that he was always right. Most of the time, people believed him. He was respected in town, successful, confident, loud, the kind of man who entered a room and expected everyone else to become smaller. For most of my life, I had done exactly that. Inside the courtroom, several members of my family were already seated. My younger brother sat beside his wife. Two cousins occupied the front row. Even people who had not spoken to me in years had shown up. They all seemed unusually relaxed, as though the outcome had already been decided, as though I was simply there to watch it happen. I took a seat near the back and quietly placed my folder on the table. Nobody greeted me. Nobody asked how I was doing. A few glanced in my direction before looking away. It did not surprise me. Ever since my mother passed away 3 years earlier, I had become something of an outsider in my own family. My father controlled the conversations. My father controlled the narrative. And according to him, I was the daughter who always caused problems by asking questions. The truth was much simpler. I remembered things other people preferred to forget. Across the room, my father leaned back in his chair and smiled at several relatives. He looked confident, relaxed, certain. Every few minutes, someone would approach him to shake his hand. More than once, I heard people discussing the estate as if it already belonged entirely to him. The Harper estate was substantial. The family home sat on nearly 60 acres of land. There were investment accounts, rental properties, agricultural leases, assets accumulated over generations. Everyone seemed convinced that today's hearing was merely a formality. Everyone except me. Because 6 weeks earlier, while sorting through a box of my mother's belongings, I had found something unexpected. A sealed envelope, my name written across the front in my mother's handwriting. I had not told anyone about it. Not my brother. Not my cousins. Certainly not my father. The courtroom doors opened. The judge entered. Conversations stopped immediately. Chairs shifted. Papers rustled. My father adjusted his tie and smiled one last time in my direction. Then he laughed quietly and shook his head as if my presence itself were ridiculous. I lowered my eyes to the folder resting in front of me. Inside it was the document that had brought me here. And within the next hour, everything my family believed about the estate was about to change. The judge reviewed several documents before calling the hearing to order. The room settled into silence. I sat quietly at my table while my father appeared completely at ease. He crossed one leg over the other and exchanged confident smiles with relatives seated nearby. Watching him, nobody would have guessed that anything unexpected could happen that morning. Then again, that was how it had always been. My father had spent decades convincing everyone that he controlled every outcome. As the hearing began, my thoughts drifted backward through the years. There was a time when I believed he admired me. When I was a little girl, I followed him everywhere around the family property. I helped feed livestock. I carried tools that were far too heavy for my small hands. I listened to stories about our family history and the responsibility of protecting what previous generations had built. Back then, I thought those lessons applied equally to all his children. I eventually learned otherwise. My younger brother, Michael, became the son my father always wanted. Michael inherited praise. Michael inherited opportunities. Michael inherited trust. I inherited expectations. Whenever something needed to be done, my father called me. Whenever someone needed care, my father called me. When my mother became ill during her final years, I was the one who drove her to appointments. I was the one who sat beside her hospital bed. I was the one who sorted medications, paid bills, and helped maintain the family home. Michael visited when convenient. My father called him devoted. I visited every day. My father called it obligation. At first, I tried not to notice the difference. Then I tried not to care. Neither approach worked very well. The greatest irony was that my mother saw everything. She rarely confronted my father directly, but she noticed every slight, every dismissal, every moment when my contributions became invisible. During the final year of her life, we spent many quiet afternoons together on the back porch overlooking the property. She often spoke about family, about fairness, about legacy. Sometimes she would pause in the middle of a conversation and simply study the field stretching beyond the fence line. Looking back now, I wonder if she was already making plans. If she already knew something the rest of us did not. A sharp sound pulled me back to the present. One of the attorneys had begun discussing ownership records. My father leaned forward confidently. The family members sitting behind him appeared equally relaxed. They expected a routine hearing. They expected paperwork. They expected confirmation that everything would remain exactly as it had always been. I opened my folder and gently touched the sealed envelope resting inside. Even now, weeks after finding it, I could still remember the moment I discovered it hidden among my mother's personal belongings. My name written carefully across the front. Her familiar handwriting. The message that followed had changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Across the courtroom, my father glanced toward me and smiled again. It was the same smile he wore whenever he believed he had already won. I lowered my eyes and remained silent. In a few minutes, the first document connected to my mother's letter would be introduced into the official record. And when that happened, the story my family had repeated for years would begin to unravel. The attorney representing the estate adjusted his glasses and requested permission to submit additional documents into evidence. My father barely reacted. He looked almost bored. To him, this was simply another step before an inevitable victory. The judge nodded, and several folders were handed forward. Papers changed hands. The quiet rhythm of legal procedure continued. Yet I could feel tension building inside me with every passing minute. Because I knew something nobody else in that room knew. The envelope from my mother had not contained a sentimental letter. It had contained instructions. Precise instructions. Along with references to records I had never seen before. When I first read it, I thought there had to be some mistake. I spent days reviewing documents. Then weeks. Every discovery led to another question. Every question led to another record. Eventually a pattern emerged. A pattern that completely contradicted the story my family had believed for years. The attorney began discussing the history of the Harper estate. He spoke about property transfers dating back decades. Tax records. Trust agreements. Ownership filings. Most people in the courtroom appeared uninterested. They expected legal language and routine explanations. My father certainly did. He leaned back comfortably and exchanged another confident glance with my brother. Then the attorney mentioned my mother's name. For the first time, my father sat a little straighter. The attorney explained that several transactions involving the estate had occurred years earlier. Transactions that had been properly filed but rarely discussed within the family. I noticed confusion spreading among some relatives. They whispered quietly among themselves. My brother frowned and began reviewing his own notes. My father remained calm, but the smile had disappeared. I remembered the afternoon I found the envelope. Rain tapped against the windows of my mother's old sewing room while I sorted boxes filled with photographs and personal keepsakes. The envelope had been hidden beneath a stack of journals. At first I almost overlooked it. Then I saw my name. The moment I recognized her handwriting, everything else disappeared. Her letter was short, direct. She explained that if certain events ever occurred, I needed to locate specific documents. She even listed where they could be found. Bank records, property filings, trust amendments. Everything had been preserved. Everything had been legal. And everything had been waiting quietly for years. Back in the courtroom, another document was introduced. The judge reviewed it carefully. Then another. The attorney's voice remained calm and professional, but I could sense the growing attention in the room. People were no longer distracted. They were listening. My father folded his arms. A small gesture. Yet after a lifetime of watching him, I recognized it immediately. It was how he reacted whenever control began slipping away. Across the aisle, my brother looked increasingly uncomfortable. The assumptions that had united the family for years were beginning to crack. Nobody understood exactly what was happening yet, but they knew something was changing. The attorney paused and opened a final folder. "Your Honor," he said, "the next document is central to determining ownership." The room became completely silent. Even my father stopped moving. And as the attorney prepared to read the first line, I realized the secret my mother had protected for years was finally about to enter the public record. The attorney cleared his throat and carefully placed the document before the judge. Every sound inside the courtroom seemed louder than before. The turning of a page, the scrape of a chair, the distant hum of the courthouse heating system. Nobody spoke. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading silently. My father stared forward with growing impatience. He was a man who disliked waiting for answers, especially answers that were beyond his control. After nearly a minute, the judge looked up. "This document appears to be a trust amendment executed 21 years ago," he said. Several heads turned immediately. My father frowned. The attorney nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The amendment was properly filed and legally recorded." My father leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. The confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to fade. The attorney continued. "The amendment was established by Margaret Harper." Hearing my mother's name spoken aloud brought a strange calm over me. For years, many people in the family had acted as though her wishes no longer mattered. Yet here she was, still shaping events from beyond her lifetime. The attorney explained that my mother had created the amendment after a lengthy consultation with legal and financial advisors. Every signature had been witnessed. Every filing had been completed correctly. Every requirement had been satisfied. There was nothing informal about it, nothing questionable. It had been sitting in public records for more than 2 decades. My brother shifted uncomfortably beside his attorney. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. They had expected discussions about inheritance percentages and management rights. Instead, they were hearing about a legal structure that few of them even knew existed. I remembered reading the document for the first time at my kitchen table. I had gone through it 3 times because I could not believe what I was seeing. Then I hired an independent attorney who confirmed the same thing. The paperwork was valid. Every page, every signature, every provision. The attorney turned another page. The amendment also includes a written statement from Mrs. Harper explaining her intentions. The courtroom grew even quieter. The judge nodded for him to proceed. My father's jaw tightened. For the first time all morning, he looked genuinely uneasy. The attorney began reading. My mother's words were simple. She wrote about stewardship, responsibility, trust. She explained that preserving the estate required someone who understood its history and values. Someone who had consistently cared for both the property and the family. As the statement continued, I felt dozens of eyes turning toward me. My father stared at the table in front of him. He no longer looked amused. He no longer looked certain. The attorney finally reached the final paragraph. Then he paused. "Your Honor," he said, "the next section identifies the individual selected to receive, controlling ownership rights under the trust amendment." Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. My father slowly lifted his head. The judge looked down at the page one more time. And in that moment, I realized the secret my mother had protected for 21 years was only seconds away from changing everything. The judge looked at the document for several seconds before setting it down carefully on the bench. No one spoke. The silence felt heavier than anything that had happened that morning. Then the attorney stood and read the final provision of the trust amendment into the record. Upon the occurrence of the conditions described herein, controlling ownership of the Harper estate shall transfer to my daughter, Evelyn Harper. For a moment, the words seemed to hang in the air without meaning. Nobody reacted. It was as if the courtroom needed time to catch up with what had just been said. Then everything changed. I heard someone gasp behind me. My brother turned sharply toward his attorney. 2 relatives exchanged stunned looks. Even the judge paused before continuing his review of the documents. Across the room, my father remained perfectly still. He blinked once. Then again. The confidence that had surrounded him all morning disappeared so quickly that it almost seemed unreal. "That cannot be correct," he said. His voice was no longer calm. The attorney immediately referred to supporting records, property filings, trust schedules, amendments, supplemental instructions. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. My mother had established a legal structure decades earlier. The estate was not controlled the way everyone believed. The assumptions repeated around family dinner tables for years had never been based on the actual paperwork. They had been based on what my father told people. The attorney continued presenting evidence. The family home, the farmland, the investment holdings, the rental properties. Everything connected back to the trust amendment. My father shook his head. "I managed that property for years," he said. "I paid the taxes. I handled the operations." The attorney nodded respectfully. That is correct, sir. Management, responsibilities, and ownership rights are separate legal matters. Several people lowered their eyes. The distinction seemed simple now, yet nobody had questioned it before, including me. For years, I accepted the same story everyone else accepted. I remembered the night I first showed the documents to an independent attorney. I had expected him to tell me I misunderstood them. Instead, he spent nearly 2 hours reviewing every page before looking up and saying something I will never forget. "Mrs. Harper, your mother was extremely thorough." At the time, I barely understood the significance of his words. Now I did. The judge reviewed another set of records and asked several procedural questions. Each answer strengthened the same conclusion. The trust was valid. The amendment was valid. The filings were valid. My father slowly sat back in his chair. He looked older than he had that morning. Not weaker, not defeated, just suddenly aware that the future he expected might not exist. I felt dozens of eyes turning toward me, yet I did not feel victorious. I felt something closer to clarity. The truth had not changed that morning. It had existed for 21 years. The only difference was that people were finally hearing it. The attorney gathered the final documents and placed them before the judge. Then he spoke one sentence that caused the entire courtroom to fall silent once again. "Your Honor, the records further indicate that Mrs. Harper's ownership interest extends to the entirety of the estate assets identified in these proceedings." The courtroom remained silent after the attorney's statement. Even the judge seemed to take an extra moment before responding. The words had been clear. There was no confusion in the language, no hidden condition, no complicated interpretation. The records indicated that the estate assets belonged entirely to me. Across the room, several family members stared at the documents as if they might somehow change if they looked long enough. My brother was the first to speak. "That does not make any sense," he said quietly. It was not an argument. It sounded more like disbelief. The attorney calmly pointed to additional filings, supporting the trust structure. Every page connected to another page. Every signature led to another record. The deeper the court examined the documents, the stronger my mother's plan appeared. My father rubbed his forehead and looked toward his attorney. "How was I never informed about this?" he asked. The question seemed directed at everyone and no one at the same time. His attorney carefully chose his words. "Sir, these records were filed according to legal requirements. They have existed in public record for many years." My father looked away. For decades, he had operated under assumptions that nobody challenged. Perhaps because nobody expected to find anything different. Perhaps because people simply accepted his version of events. The judge reviewed several more exhibits before asking whether there were any objections to the validity of the trust amendment. None were presented. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. I thought about my mother. I remembered sitting beside her during her final summer. One evening, we watched the sun disappear beyond the fields while she spoke about responsibility. At the time, I assumed she was talking about everyday matters. Maintaining the property, caring for family, preserving traditions. Now I understood she had been speaking about something much larger. She had spent years preparing for a moment she knew might someday arrive. The judge continued reviewing the record. My relatives no longer looked confident. They looked confused. Some appeared embarrassed. Others seemed lost in thought. The certainty that had united them earlier that morning was gone. For the first time, people were questioning assumptions they had carried for years. Then the attorney introduced another document. This one contained a personal statement from my mother that had not yet been read aloud. The judge granted permission. The attorney unfolded the page carefully and began reading. My mother's words filled the courtroom. She wrote that ownership was not a reward. It was a responsibility. She explained that the person chosen to protect the estate should be the person who consistently protected the family when no one else was watching. She wrote about loyalty, about sacrifice, about quiet acts that often went unnoticed. As the statement continued, I noticed several people lowering their eyes. Nobody needed to ask who she was describing. Then the attorney reached the final sentence. He paused briefly before reading it aloud. "I have complete confidence that my daughter Evelyn will preserve what matters most, not because she seeks ownership, but because she understands stewardship." When the reading ended, nobody spoke. Not my brother, not my relatives, not even my father. For the first time that morning, the most powerful man in the family had nothing to say. The silence remained long after my mother's statement had been read into the record. It was not the kind of silence created by confusion. It was the kind created by recognition. People were finally seeing something that had been present all along. My father sat motionless at the council table. The man who had filled every room with certainty suddenly seemed unsure of where to look. The judge reviewed the final pages of the trust documents and then placed them neatly on the bench. "The record is clear," he said. "The amendment is valid and enforceable." No one objected. No one could. Every challenge that might have been raised had already been answered by the paperwork itself. My brother lowered his eyes. Several relatives stared at the floor. Earlier that morning, they had entered the courthouse expecting a simple confirmation of what they believed belonged to my father. Now they were confronting a completely different reality. I felt no satisfaction watching their reactions, only a strange sense of calm. For years, I had questioned my own memories. I had wondered whether I had imagined the sacrifices my mother made, whether I had exaggerated the responsibility I carried after her illness, whether I had misunderstood the distance that slowly developed within the family. Yet every document presented that morning told the same story. My mother had seen everything clearly. She had understood exactly what was happening long before anyone else did. The attorney then introduced one final exhibit. Unlike the legal filings, this document was personal. It contained notes written by my mother over several years. They were not instructions. They were observations. The judge allowed portions to be entered into the record. As the attorney read them aloud, I felt my chest tighten. My mother described family gatherings, holidays, difficult conversations. She wrote about watching each of her children grow older. She wrote about character, reliability, trust. Again and again, one theme appeared throughout her notes. She valued actions more than words. The attorney eventually reached a passage that seemed to affect everyone in the courtroom. "The strongest person is often the one nobody notices," my mother had written. "The one carrying responsibility while others receive recognition." No one moved. Across the room, my father closed his eyes briefly. I could not remember ever seeing him look vulnerable before. The judge thanked the attorney and returned the document. Then he asked if anyone wished to make an additional statement before the hearing concluded. Nobody spoke. Not my brother. Not the relatives who had spent years repeating assumptions about the estate. Not even the attorneys. Finally, my father slowly rose from his chair. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward him. For a moment, he simply stood there. The confident smile from earlier that morning was gone. The laughter was gone. The certainty was gone. He looked across the room until his eyes met mine. Then, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard before, he said, "I did not know she felt that way." It was the first honest thing I had heard him say all day. My father's words lingered in the courtroom long after he sat down. "I did not know she felt that way." It was a simple sentence. Yet it seemed to carry more weight than all the confident speeches and assumptions that had filled the room earlier that morning. The judge remained silent for a moment before continuing with the final review of the record. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged the documents anymore. The legal questions had been answered. What remained were the emotional ones. Those were far more complicated. I looked at my father and realized something I had never fully understood before. For years, I believed he had intentionally ignored what my mother and I contributed to the family. Perhaps part of that was true. But sitting there now, I began to suspect something else. He had spent so many years believing his own version of the story that he no longer recognized any other version existed. The courtroom had become unusually quiet. Several relatives stared at the documents scattered across the tables. Others seemed lost in thought. My brother remained focused on the floor in front of him. Nobody looked victorious. Nobody looked defeated. They simply looked uncertain. The attorney gathered the final exhibits and prepared them for filing. As he worked, the judge asked whether anyone wished to address the court before the hearing concluded. For several seconds, nobody responded. Then my father slowly stood again. This time, his voice sounded older, softer. "Margaret never discussed any of this with me," he said. The statement hung in the air. I thought about that carefully. It sounded like an explanation, maybe even a defense. But deep down, I knew it was not the whole truth. My mother had spent years trying to be heard. The problem was never that she failed to speak. The problem was that nobody listened closely enough, including him. The judge nodded politely and thanked him for his statement. Then he looked toward me. For a brief moment, I considered saying nothing. Silence had become familiar over the years. It was often easier than explaining disappointment, easier than revisiting old wounds. But my mother's words echoed in my mind. Responsibility, stewardship, truth. I slowly rose from my chair. Every eye in the courtroom turned toward me. My mother loved this family, I said. My voice remained calm. Everything she did was meant to protect it. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. She did not create these documents to punish anyone. She created them because she wanted the future of the estate guided by responsibility rather than assumptions. I glanced briefly toward my father. I do not believe she wanted division. I believe she wanted honesty. The room remained completely silent. Then I sat down. There was nothing more to say. The truth was already sitting in front of everyone. The judge reviewed his notes one final time. Outside the courthouse windows, the afternoon light had begun to soften. Hours had passed since I first walked into that room, while people laughed and dismissed my presence. Everything felt different now, not because the estate belonged to me, but because for the first time in many years, my mother's voice had finally been heard. And as the judge prepared to announce the court's final decision, I saw something in my father's expression that I had never seen before. Regret. The judge reviewed the final documents one last time before delivering his decision. His voice was calm and measured. Every legal requirement had been satisfied. Every filing had been verified. Every challenge had been addressed. The trust amendment was valid. The ownership structure established by my mother would remain in effect exactly as written. With those words, the hearing came to an end. Nobody celebrated. Nobody argued. The room simply sat in silence for a few moments as everyone absorbed what had happened. The assumptions that had shaped our family for decades had been replaced by facts. My brother slowly gathered his papers. Several relatives quietly left their seats. Conversations that would have filled the room earlier never began. People seemed reluctant to speak. Perhaps they were reconsidering memories. Perhaps they were questioning things they once accepted without evidence. I remained seated for a moment longer. The estate mattered. The property mattered. The financial assets mattered. But as I looked around the courtroom, I realized something else mattered more. For the first time since my mother's passing, the truth had been allowed to stand on its own. No explanations. No distortions. No assumptions. Just the truth. Across the room, my father remained at his table. The proud posture he carried into the courthouse that morning was gone. He looked tired. Older somehow. Not because of the court's decision, but because certainty had finally given way to reflection. As people began leaving, he slowly walked toward me. Several years earlier, I might have dreaded that moment. Instead, I felt calm. He stopped a few feet away and looked at me. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he nodded. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, yet it carried more sincerity than many conversations we had shared over the years. "Your mother trusted you," he said quietly. I nodded. She did. He looked toward the courthouse windows where the afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. I should have paid more attention. There was no defense in his voice. No attempt to rewrite history. Just a simple acknowledgement. I did not know whether that would change anything between us. Some wounds require time. Others never fully disappear. But hearing those words felt like the beginning of something honest. We stood there for another moment before he turned and walked away. I watched him leave without anger. Without triumph. Only understanding. A few minutes later, I stepped outside the courthouse. The cold November air greeted me immediately. The clouds that had covered the sky that morning were beginning to break apart. Sunlight touched the rooftops surrounding the town square. People moved along the sidewalks, carrying on with ordinary life. Cars passed. Store doors opened and closed. The world had not changed. Yet I felt different. For years, I believed recognition was what I wanted. It was not. What I wanted was truth. And truth had finally arrived. I looked across the street and smiled softly. My mother had protected more than an estate. She had protected a legacy built on responsibility, integrity, and quiet strength. As I walked toward my car, I realized the most valuable thing she left behind was not land or money. It was the certainty that she had seen me clearly all along. And with that thought, I stepped forward into the future she had trusted me to protect.